I was a summer hire at NASA Lewis, which is now NASA Glenn, and I worked in the 10 by 10 supersonic wind tunnel. I learned Fortran, and I got to run my first CFD code. I had done a grid convergence study, and I plotted the results of mass capture by grid size, and I showed it to my boss, and he literally sat there quietly and just stared at the plot for about 5 minutes. He called his boss in, and what he said to his boss was, that 1% of mass I thought we were losing, it might be right here in the grid. It might be a grid effect in the CFD. And that was a light bulb moment for me, is that the simulation can have that level of effect on the results. Something that we all know now, but back then, especially for me as a junior in college, and apparently it caught my boss off guard as well.
This episode is sponsored by Latticep, a consulting company for the oil and gas industry and a distributor of the Lattice Boltzmann code, MSTAR. In today's episode, I'll be interviewing John Chawner. John attended Syracuse University and the University of Texas Arlington. He joined General Dynamics, now Lockheed Martin, and then went on to co-found Pointwise. He's an AIAA fellow and a member of the NASA CFD 2030 Vision Study. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss an episode. Thank you, John, for joining today. I'm really, really excited to talk with you about this.
This is great. It's been a long time since we talked last, and most of our conversations have been online on social media, so this should be an interesting discussion.
Yes. So for those who are not as familiar with your experience and your influence in the CFD community, can you give us an intro on your background and how you started and a little bit of your career and where you're at now?
Okay, just kind of I'll broad brush it. So I'm a Midwesterner. I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Before I was age 5, I lived in 3 states: Pennsylvania, where I was born, West Virginia, and then Ohio. But I grew up outside of Cleveland. I went to Syracuse for my undergrad. I got a BS in mechanical and aerospace in '84. Came down to Texas after I graduated and ended up getting a master's degree in aerospace engineering on the part-time program. So I went while I was working. So it's the 6-year master's degree that I finished in 1990. But I skipped the part where when I got out of school, I came down to work at General Dynamics here in Fort Worth, which is now Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. So that was in '84, and I worked there for 7 years. When I got out of school, I was really interested in high-speed gas dynamics. So I started working in the propulsion aerodynamics group, and CFD was brand new back then. So they said to me, "Here's CFD. See if you can make it work for this stuff that we're doing." So that was my starting job, applied CFD, and I transferred out of propulsion into the CFD group in '87. That's when I started working on the old GridGen software. I was one of the original 3 developers of that through '91. In '91, I left General Dynamics and went to work for MDA Engineering, which was a company run by my master's advisor, Dale Anderson, whose name you probably recognize from the textbook Anderson, Tannehill, and Pletcher. Worked for him for 3 years and then co-founded Pointwise with John Steinbrenner in '94, and then ran that until 2021. That was a great 26.5-year run. And we got acquired by Cadence Design Systems. I worked for them for 2 years, and then I retired about a year ago.
And how's retirement treating you?
I highly recommend it. It's
awesome.
That 39-year career, especially running a small company, that takes a lot out of you. So I've really enjoyed the downtime, being able to relax and make this phase of my life more about my wife and what we do together rather than work. I've got to say that owning a small business is like agreeing to be punched in the face for a living. So I was glad to kind of let that leave that behind and move on to kind of other safer pursuits.
That's so comforting, as I've recently ventured out on my own. So I know that that's just the norm.
Yes, you are not alone.
That's good. So thank you for awesome introduction, and really excited to break this down more. But coming back to your work at General Dynamics, what influence did that have on your career? Like, you started out, as you said, not in CFD at first, which is maybe what some might consider a non-typical path in today's routes to getting to CFD. But
Well, to answer your question directly and simply, it had a huge influence. My experience at General Dynamics right out of school with my undergrad was absolutely fantastic. But I want to back up one
okay,
job prior to that.
yeah,
The summer of my junior year, which was 1983, I was a summer hire at NASA Lewis, which is now NASA Glenn, and I worked in the 10 by 10 supersonic wind tunnel. And I learned Fortran, and I got to run my first CFD code, which was a method of characteristics code on a supersonic inlet, like the ones you see on the SR-71 or the A-12. If your knowledge of airplanes goes that far back, which was a fantastic experience. But what foreshadowed the future, and this is kind of odd when I look back on it, I had done a grid convergence study in this MOC code and I looked at the variation of mass capture by the inlet as the step size. This is a kind of like a hyperbolic code, so it's a
okay,
stepwise code. And I plotted the results of mass capture by grid size, and I showed it to my boss, and he literally sat there quietly and just stared at the plot for about 5 minutes. He called his boss in, and what he said to his boss was, that 1% of mass I thought we were losing, it might be right here in the grid. It might be a grid effect in the CFD. And that was a light bulb moment for me, is that the simulation can have that level of effect on the results. Something that we all know now, but back then, especially for me as a junior in college, and apparently it caught my boss off guard as well. So that was kind of interesting doing that. But he was a great boss, fantastic boss, great experience working there, given a lot of freedom, access to their computer resources, technical reports to read, and someone who mentored me without kind of putting too tight a guardrails on what I got to do. And that was a fantastic experience, which then, as I alluded to before, working at General Dynamics also had a huge influence on the rest of my career. Like you said, I started out as an applied CFD person, not too different from career paths that early career professionals can take these days, right? You don't have to get into CFD as a PhD who has to develop code. You can get in as an applied person who understands the aerodynamics, the fluid dynamics, the thermodynamics, and then use that to develop expertise to move into the software development side. And so, as I said before, too, they had just started the CFD group the year before I got there. 83, they started the CFD group at General Dynamics, and it was a bunch of 22 to 25-year-olds who were basically given the resources of this large corporation and said, write us some CFD. And we wrote a lot of CFD in the 7 years that I was there, and people I know that are still there continue to write a world-class CFD capability. We wrote a paper that was published by Steve Carman and I think John Steinbrenner, and I forget who else was on it, at an AGARD conference in France that was the first 3D CFD for a fighter aircraft with operating propulsion components. And that was, I believe, was in 1987. And that, the lead author on that was the late Steve Carman, who was a great friend of mine. We worked together at GD. He went on to teach at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. Then he worked at Pointwise for a while before going to Oak Ridge. And that's the other part of the huge influence, is that so many of the people I worked with in those early days at General Dynamics came back around later in my career in various capacities. Many of them I got reacquainted with when they joined Pointwise, so they were teammates later on down the road. And it's funny because my college roommate, his daughter just finished her freshman year at Syracuse. And last summer when I was out there, I told her as she was getting ready to go to campus, I said, look, when you're on the dorm and you're seeing the other students in your dorm floor and you're sitting in class and you see the other students around you, think carefully about those friendships you make, because you may be stuck with those same people 40 years later. Because my roommate and I are still really good friends. And it's a lesson that comes up often. And just imagine, think of it, to be in that CFD group and creating CFD from the ground up, from meshing to the solvers to visualization even that we had to do ourselves. So it was a great opportunity, rich with, advancement at all times. And we really, in 7 years, we had developed a really great CFD capability that took us in a lot of places, and that the legacy of that. I mean, I'm not taking credit for what they're doing there now, but the legacy of that is the basis for that CFD group that they maintain in house with their own solvers. So it was a fantastic time, and of course, I met John Steinbrenner there, who later turned out to be my Pointwise co-founder.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I want to back up. The idea for the grid convergence study at NASA, was that just, how did you get that idea? Were you always thinking along those lines? Or can you tell a little bit more about context there and
Well,
how that came about?
yeah, I mean, keep in mind that I was a college junior, and I really, I didn't know much about CFD. In fact, I don't think I'd ever really heard CFD at all, and no one was using the term CFD to describe what I was doing. It was just a computational technique for simulating these inlets that they were testing for supersonic aircraft. And keep in mind what I said before about the latitude that my boss, whose name was Bobby Sanders, who unfortunately is also passed on, that he had given me. So, I was able to take this code and look at it in different ways and say, well, what can I do with it? Let's try changing the inputs and see how it affects the outputs. It was not, I wasn't thinking grid convergence, but I was thinking about how robust is this? What can I make it do? How do I break it? And I broke a lot of things while I was there in a benign way, but that was kind of the motivation, just that curiosity about what the software could do. And the interesting thing was I learned Fortran, programming in Fortran that summer as well. So I did a lot of reading and practice on that, which was handy when I went back to Syracuse for my senior year, because out of the blue, one of the professors decided that, oh, by the way, your programming for your senior design has to be done in Fortran, even though we've never taught any of you a single Fortran course. They don't even offer one. But he said, that's what everyone uses, so you ought to learn it. So guess he did all the programming on that project.
That's very fortuitous that it worked out for you. That's awesome.
Well, see, good fortune, as we go through this discussion, I think you're going to see that as a recurring theme. I've been very fortunate in the various places I've found myself at and the people I've found myself in. That's a recurring theme of kind of my past 40 years.
Yeah. So what did you do? You left General Dynamics and went to MDA. What motivated that change?
Well, I wish it would say, I wish I could say it was something like prescience about entrepreneurship and future opportunities. But if you remember your defense contracting back in the 1990 timeframe, the budgets were going down, and that was right after the time that the A-12 program got canceled. I mean, cut in one day. I mean, I carpooled with a guy who was on the A-12 program, and we drove into work together with him employed. And when I drove home with him that evening, he didn't have a job, he didn't have health insurance, didn't have a security clearance anymore, had all this stuff in a box. So that was a disastrous day. Like 4,000 people got let go that day just at General Dynamics alone. So there was and it was quite a controversial thing. I don't mean to get into aerospace contracting history, but it was a blanket cancellation of the program, not a wind down. The DoD just said, we're done, which was kind of a rare thing. So you look at the writing on the wall, and John Steinbrenner and I talked, and we were like, well, what does that mean for us? Because, funding mesh generation isn't really a huge priority for, a big defense contractor when times are bad. And interestingly enough, in the conference room after I had defended my thesis, and it was at the end and everyone else had left, it was just me and Dale Anderson, he said, have you ever thought about going to work for a small company? And I said, no. And then he talked about, he had this company of about 5 people that did research. Many professors had these kind of companies, right? They they teach during the day, but they have a company on the side so they can do research contracts and things like that that aren't amenable to the academic environment. So he explained what he had in mind, and he extended the same offer to John, and take that in combination with what was happening, at General Dynamics. I could have been the next person to get laid off. So we were like, let's go ahead and make that switch. And so we kind of just, it was, when was it? It was spring of 91. It was like April or May. And when we came in the door, what Dale said to us, he's a professor, he's about teaching. He said, learn the business, learn by doing, see how I run the business, draw lessons from that. And when you're ready, go do your own thing if you want to. And, that's why you're here, is to learn. And so we ended up continuing, John Steinbrenner and I ended up continuing our contracting on GridGen R&D, and we developed two subsequent versions of GridGen up through 1994 for NASA, which was fun because we got to pick up kind of right where we left off. And it was a real learning experience those 3 years, because we started doing commercial things on the side that the small business allowed that we couldn't do at General Dynamics. Like we do for-fee training, we did support contracts, because GridGen was still a freely available program that you just call up the Air Force and ask for. But we would, we'd put custom modifications in for people. We would teach them how to use it, and we'd answer the phone for a fee if they called with a question. So that's kind of how we started that commercial transition while we were still doing the R&D.
So what were some of the business lessons that you learned from Dale in working closely with him in that environment?
Well, they're not revelatory in the sense when I say them, you will be very underwhelmed, because it's like business is really about satisfying a customer and generating revenue. That's why you're in business. You got to keep the lights on, the doors open, and pay salaries and things like that. And you do that by finding your customer and keeping them satisfied. I think it's Tom Peters that's a paraphrase of one of his quotes, which means that even though the tech is cool, and John Steinbrenner and I loved CFD and we loved meshing and we thought it was cool and we did all sorts of stuff with it, that doesn't pay the bills. So it's about kind of how do we generate value and how do we add value to the basic, product that we had. And then one of the final lessons was, marketing is more than just a silly brochure. This is back in the days, pre-internet. So you had paper brochures that you take to a conference, and that's really isn't what marketing is about telling that story and getting people interested in what you're doing. So those are some of the things that I remember taking away from working with Dale for 3 years up until 94.
Yeah. So tell us about the creation and the founding of Pointwise.
Okay, so in the line of recurring themes, right? We left General Dynamics because business was declining. Well, the market for getting continued R&D contracts to continue developing GridGen, as we had been doing, was also declining. So we had done NASA for the Air Force for 3 years before we left GD. And then we did NASA for 3 years. And then we were going to do what would have been GridGen version, I think 9 for NASA. We had a statement of work that we were proposing. They're like, we just don't have the budget. So then it's like, wow, okay, we're in another situation where it's like, what are we going to do here? And, we had done commercialization of GridGen training, support, and things like that. And that had generated some revenue. And still, fortunately, at this time, we were still the only people who had programmed it for most part. I mean, under the hood, no one else really knew how it worked. So I remember John and I had lunch at a restaurant near where MDA had their offices. And the discussion came down to what's the most amount of damage we could do to our careers in a year if this thing crashes and burns, if we decide to go commercial. And we reached the conclusion that we never had to test, fortunately, that we were probably still employable if it didn't go. But we wanted to give it a shot. And we said, okay, uh, Dale, you said when we came in the door that when the time was right, we could go, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to take GridGen commercial. And the funny thing, in order to do that, we actually had to go buy a license of our software from NASA. If you remember the old Cosmic repository of NASA software, we had to pay $1,000 to get our own source code back, and that's how we started Pointwise. And then it was off to the races. This was November of '94, I think.
Okay. So, although Dale had hinted at that when you came in the door, looking back before that, was that ever a desire of yours to run a business? Or looking back, do you see maybe an affinity to a commercial side of things? Or was it just a natural evolution of progress for you?
There's bits and pieces. The answer is never as simple as you try to make it because, I was a big shuttle nerd. Late high school and college, I had a big poster of the space shuttle up on the wall in my bedroom and all that. And I think for my college essay, I wrote that I wanted to be uh, the owner of the first private, space shuttle type, launch space access company, which other than saying that I had ideas that running a business is something that I wanted to do, I mean, it didn't really foreshadow what I ended up actually doing. Um, Now, at the same time, later in high school, I also thought I wanted to be an archaeologist specializing in Egyptology because I was kind of fascinated with pyramids, which in the end, as a mesh generation guy, I also became fascinated with pyramids and then never really knew how much of a pain in the butt they actually were. But then I think that it just turned out to be the natural evolution. Forming Pointwise was the logical next step. I mean, John and I had started as young engineers within General Dynamics, developed a lot of capabilities over the first 7 years of our career, got a taste of the commercial market a little bit when we worked for Dale for 3 years. And so the next step was to say, let's try it and go full commercial with the software as well. And I think so there's a for me in particular, there was kind of like a built-in, yeah, I might like to do that someday, run a business, have a business. But then the situations you find themselves in kind of lead you in that direction. And John and I, eventually Rick Matus, when he joined us to run Pointwise, we were all pretty conservative. So this wasn't done on a whim. We were uh, very circumspect in how we considered, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What the potential upside and what's the potential downside? And that's a question I continue to ask a lot of business owners when I consult with them about when they're considering a decision. I advise that they consider what's the worst thing that can happen. How far are you willing to let it go before you say I'm done? Right? Uh, because that's an important thing to know. That when it gets to this situation, when all this money is gone, or when I've gone like 2 months without a paycheck or whatever, that's when I draw the line. And it's best to know that in advance rather than wait until you're in the midst of it because things get all crazy then. And you want to have that clarity of thought going forward. So again, we decided that we really couldn't screw our careers up that badly if we tried Pointwise and it didn't work out. And knock on wood, by the end of the first year, we were so busy, and our coworker from General Dynamics, Rick Matus, who had left, I think, before we left and gone to work at Fluent, he was the product manager for the Fluent product for them. We found out he was looking for another opportunity, and we just got together. And once you make that decision, though, there's no looking back. I mean, people ask, were you ever scared? It's like, no, because you're too busy to be scared. Because that once we started, it was 12, 16-hour days for like a year straight, 7 days a week, the whole bit.
Wow, that's intense. Um, What surprised you about that, right? You said you looked at the downsides of it, but were there things, and you were very methodical in thinking through the plan, right? You mentioned you're all conservative, but what were the surprises, or were there things that you didn't expect in starting a technical business like that?
Um, One thing that I found to be true over the years is that in a technical business, the technical decisions are always way easier than the business decisions. Do I do feature A or feature B? Do we port to this platform? These are things where you have a lot of expertise. Um, you can quantify it to a certain degree. You quantify the potential outcomes. It's relatively straightforward, and which makes them easier. You can have a rational discussion, but then running a business is like, when do you hire? When do you fire? When do you change health insurance? Who do you partner with? Who do you not partner with? All of those kind of decisions are left with are in a gray area, right? Where you have to rely on a different skill set, which I lacked at the time. And that makes it very difficult. It doesn't make them impossible. And maybe because I'm so conservative, I like to have more of that kind of warm fuzzy before I make a decision versus kind of just taking that leap. But that was the one thing, is that tech decisions are way easier than the business decisions. The other one has to do with people. And someone told me to this kind of late in the Pointwise days, and it was a professor. We had a visiting professor program in the summers, and he was down the hall when we were having our monthly staff meeting in the big conference room. And he came to me after that meeting. He said, you know how I know that Pointwise is a great company? He said, I couldn't hear what you were saying, but I could hear the laughter and the enthusiasm and the applause as you talked about the business and the products and the things like that. So having that core team and having that culture fit, because the other thing, another uh, associate of ours had said once, he said, I'm willing to bet that if you had two job candidates that were roughly equivalent, one was superior technically and one was a better culture fit, you'd choose the one with the better culture fit. And I said, like, every day of the week, because there's nothing like a toxic person to erode all that internal trust. Because it's true, you spend more time almost with your coworkers than you do with your family. And I'm not trying to say that Pointwise is a family, because that's a cliche that's kind of been beat to death. But having team members you can trust, that you innately know are skilled and talented, right? That's table stakes to get involved. You got to know what you're doing. But also they have vision, they can collaborate and work together. Uh, that was key. So important. In fact, collaboration turned out to be one of Pointwise's core values. So those are the two main things that became very clear, because as a technician, as an engineer doing a business, and I do this, and I assume other people do it as well, because it's safe to go back to the things you know, right? I know how to write code. I know meshing. If I just do that and I get other people to focus on that, everything will work out well. And it's not like that in practice. It's also like, um, I think it was Emerson who's quoted as saying, build a better mousetrap and people will beat a path to your door. Well, I think that's wrong. That might be Thoreau. It's either Thoreau or Emerson, I think. It's wrong, because you need marketing to do that. It doesn't really work out that way. You got to tell a story, and marketing isn't a bad word. A lot of engineers don't like marketing. There's a joke. There's a Dilbert cartoon that marketing is just liquor and guessing, and it's not like that. It's communication, telling the story, why you're doing things, what you're doing, and things like that. So all of those pieces, and building that environment where people can be their best is kind of like really the key to making the business run.
So, did you have like an external board to help you with some of those decisions, or maybe informal mentors as far as the structure of Pointwise?
Well, the easy answer is we did not have an external board of advisors, and we debated it a couple times. Should we do it? Should we start it? How do we run it? And as we got toward the end days, and we didn't know they were the end days at that time, but we were like, yeah, maybe we should relook at that again. But we never did. we were fortunate in that we had a great set of um, consultants or third-party vendors like legal, accounting, HR, who this was a paid relationship where they were doing, our accountant was a great accountant because he would act like our CFO. And our lawyer was a great lawyer because he would act like our general counsel.
General
So
counsel.
finding those people to supplement your team, the things where you aren't good at, was was key. So that was kind of cheating and having an advisory board. Uh, Toward the end, when we made the transition from GridGen to Pointwise, that software transition where Pointwise software is like the next generation version of GridGen. And the analogy we used was after a while, GridGen was like 10 pounds in a 5-pound box, and we just needed to have a new framework. We did assemble an advisory team to help us develop that product. So it was a select group of customers and partners that we showed code to before we started to write it, get their feedback on do it this way, not that way, things like that. And that worked out quite well, but never on the kind of business side. And the other thing on the business side was uh, in the late 90s and maybe into 2000, I had thought about going back and getting an executive MBA, doing an MBA part-time. And it's funny because in preparing for not in preparation for this interview, but while I was, coming up with this, our discussion today, I was also, we were talking before that we had just moved into a new house. So I was unpacking all sort of boxes, and I found a box that has a supplement from the Dallas Morning News in September of 2000, where I was interviewed, and it's probably Engineers Week or something like that. And it says, I wish I had the formal background in business that an MBA would give me. So I was thinking about it at one time. And that's definitely true. Like, having that formal background to know how to do things because you were taught, how to set up marketing plans and business plans and how to track finances, having that formal background so you don't have to think about it, you don't have to invent it, you just do what you were taught. That would have been very handy. Uh, Everything that I did on the business, I learned by doing. And okay, it may have been slower, but I don't think we did too much damage by not having that background. But when I was looking at it, this is like 1997, 98, 99. Um, we were busy at Pointwise. I had 2 kids, wife, house, the whole thing. I was like, I can't imagine going back and taking classes and doing homework again. I just couldn't do it. So I decided to stick it out and just, not do the MBA and just do the best I could to learn through other sources by reading as much as I possibly could.
Yeah. Had you Had you always been a reader? I found your blog a while ago and went back and looked at your book list that you kind of summarized through the years of what you've read. But did that happen more as a way to fill that gap that you perceived between what the business needed from you and what your training had been?
I think that's definitely true. Because just down the hall from me in this new house, there's a bedroom full of cardboard boxes full of all my books that I don't have a place to put. And so half of my reading was business books, just to fill in that knowledge gap
Yeah.
and supplement, get ideas. And then the other half are just fiction reading so that I could keep my sanity, right? So a little escape from meshing in CFD and running a business, just to do some fiction reading. And I think you mentioned the blog, so I'm a art fan, so I have a lot of art books as well that I tend to read just to as a palate cleanser from all of the how to run a business kind of things. But that was very helpful because the funny thing is when you read enough, or at least my experience is that you find out that the good ideas get repeated over and over again. I mean, I'm talking about going all the way back to Ben Franklin's autobiography, to Marcus Aurelius, to yeah, Adam Grant. I think that was the fellow who's got a really popular book right now, and Patrick Lencioni and all those writers. I'm not saying that they're copying ideas, but the themes, the good things get carried forward, and the things that don't really work out well get dropped along the way by subsequent authors. And those authors I did mention are really good. I highly recommend that you, if you're interested, that you read them. Especially Lencioni's books. They're easy reads, and they're very they have good lessons in them. So I supplemented that as well. But there's a there's another. My sons call me a book geek because I've got books all the time. I'm reading on a plane all the time. I used to, my commute to the office used to be 45 minutes one way, so I had audiobooks going all the time in the car. So that was maybe it's like compensation. In the old house, I had a bookshelf kind of behind me when we were doing Zoom meetings, and one of my friends at Cadence, when we were in Zoom meetings, said, "What are all those books up there?" And I said, "Compensation. Compensation for a lack of skills elsewhere."
That's good. That's very comforting because I find myself turning to books more and more too. And I love Adam Grant. Adam Grant is a great thinker and author, and he's been extremely valuable. But I haven't read much of Patrick. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. How'd you say it? Lencioni?
Lencioni.
Yeah,
His book he's most well known for is Five Dysfunctions of a Team.
of a team.
But then there's got to be a dozen, and they're all written in what I would call fable form. There's a fictional story in the front that illustrates the problem the book is going to solve about how a business owner goes to an advisor, gets advice, implements the advice, and solves the problem. And then in the back is here's how you would do this yourself. It's more of a nonfiction account of how to go ahead and implement these ideas. And it's an easy read, but there's all sort of books like that. And if you want to go off on a tangent, I could talk about Vistage, which is one of my passions as well.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about Vistage. When did you decide to join, and what were the benefits?
Well, I just retired from Vistage. I'm now a Vistage alum, so I was in for 10 years. And it was Mike Peary, who used to be the CEO at TechPlot, who for years, when we would talk, he'd say, "Look, I've been a member of Vistage. You really ought to join Vistage." And I'm like, "Well, what is this Vistage?" Vistage is the world's largest CEO peer advisory and professional development organization. You join a local group that's run by a Vistage coach of 12 to 18 other business owners and leaders. You meet monthly, and the meetings are two parts. Number one, there's a professional development part, which is you get world-class speakers come in, like authors, some of the authors of these books come in and teach you about everything from marketing to HR to sales, hiring, legal, finance, all that kind of stuff. Right? AI. That was one of the last Vistage speakers I had heard before I retired. And that was fantastic unto itself because it satisfied my need to learn and come up with new ideas and fill voids in my own knowledge. The other half of the meeting is all of the other business. This is a group that's run under a non-disclosure confidentiality agreement. So all of the other business owners in your group then act as your private board of advisors. So you can bring issues to that group and say, "Okay, here's what I'm currently struggling with. How would you guys handle this?" And there's a process that Vistage has for going through that, for diagnosing what's really going on. Sometimes it's about matter. Comes down to you're not really asking the right question. That's really not your problem. Your problem is this. And then they make a bunch of suggestions about here's what I would do in your situation, blah, blah, blah. And you choose which ones, if any, you want to try. But the most important thing is then you're held accountable, because the next meeting they will say, "Well, did you do that yet?" And after a while, it becomes one of those things. If you haven't done it after a while, it's like, well, maybe are you wasting our time, or is that really not important to you? So, for example, who else holds the CEO accountable? Nobody. It was extremely helpful from that regard, and I consider my Vistage membership after 10 years to be one of the greatest of being a business owner in the last 10 years. Could you can look at our Pointwise's financials and see when my membership started, because we applied. I took those items back. I talked to them with John about them with John and Rick, and we actually put some of the better ones into motion. The other
Wow.
cool thing about Vistage is that as the member, when we had speakers, I could bring one of my team to hear the speakers. So it's free professional development for them,
Okay.
which was fantastic. And then I had another one of my direct reports in a Vistage key group, which is someone who's not the CEO, but they still get to have the meetings and in their own. And because she and I would often hear the same speaker in that week, we would go back to the office and then do a roundtable over lunch. We'd say, here's what the speaker said, and allow people to ask questions and talk about it. And, how are we going to implement this? What do you think? And we'd be able to share that knowledge. So it wasn't just about, my professional growth. We were able to share it with the rest of the staff. So I think it was absolutely well worth the money. Mike Peary at TechPlot had told me, if you solve one non-trivial business problem per year, it pays for the entire membership for that year. And I can tell you that I solved more than one problem per year. We had a speaker on HR who talked about employee handbooks, how to do them properly. And we had been struggling to do ours, and within a week, ours was done based on what I had learned from him. And we put that to bed and moved on. So there's a lot. It was a fantastic experience. Anyone who's listening who has a business and wants to grow that business, I point you to Vistage and see if you can find a chapter in your area. That's Vistage.
We can put the link in the notes as well. So maybe jumping back a little bit to this idea, still on this business more focused idea though, of this is something that I was exposed to. Schumpeter proposed an economic theory called creative destruction. And the idea is that if you aren't proactively and intentionally trying to destroy, it's a strong word, but that's the word he uses in his theory, to destroy your existing business by creating newer, better tools, someone else or another competitor will. And so does that theory align with what your experience was in trying to innovate and outdo yourselves and improve the product?
Well, the good news is that CFD people hate meshing with such a passion that we didn't have to worry about too many people.
Too many competitors in the space?
Now, that's obviously not true, but that's one way to look at it. Schumpeter, that theory sounds like Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, which I read, and that really resonated with me when I read that book. And it's basically about, if you don't, you're going to get eaten from below unless you disrupt yourself. Now, having said all that, with the preamble out of the way, I'm not certain we went into it looking at it in terms of continuous disruption. From the CFD standpoint and the software that we were writing, the list of advancements that were required to be impactful in the engineering space, what our customers were telling us, where our customers wanted us to go, was so long that we were continuously writing new code, exploring new methods, delivering what the FlowSolver people needed. We made that transition from multi-block structured grids to unstructured grids, so we had to kind of supplement the code by adding that capability. We then did high order meshes. Since leaving Pointwise, I understand that they've released polyhedral meshing as well. All of these capabilities are driven by the needs to kind of feed the CFD ecosystems the things they need to kind of up the ante and up the bar in terms of performance and things like that. So we were always kind of reinventing the software. I'm trying to think of the right words. I mean, we're always developing new capabilities, releasing new versions of the software, and expanding it and growing it all of the time. Now, if you want to call that disruption, great. If you want to call that just self-improvement, uh, or product improvement, that's cool as well. Um, it does, my Vistage friends who weren't in the software business could not fathom that we were basically writing new products all the time, but it was the same product and kept reinvesting all that R&D money back in to the same product because their products basically, some of them who are in retail or in construction, their products essentially don't change. There's a lot of service oriented things. And that's not meant as a jab at them. It's a different, and that was cool. Not to get back on the Vistage thing, but the cool thing was experiencing the world of business from other people's perspectives, the unique aspects of their target customers, their product lines, and things like that. So, I mean, does that answer make sense? Getting back to your question about creative destruction.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely. I guess my next question, though, is how did you prioritize that? Sounds like laundry list of improvements, right? How do you even go about tackling that? Rank it by.
Well, if
Well, anyway.
if any of my former colleagues are listening to this, they will be laughing right now because they will say we did a poor job of doing that because literally we maintained a database of thousands of requests that people wanted, everything from make this button turn green on Tuesdays to you need automatic unstructured hex meshing tomorrow on GPUs tomorrow. And so the prioritization,
Not yesterday?
well, they would take it yesterday. Um,
Oh, okay.
it's the prioritization took into account a lot of things. One of the processes that we included in the way we managed the software product was a weekly or biweekly meeting with representatives from sales who represented prospective customers, tech support who represented current customers, R&D who were saying, okay, these features, these capabilities we're developing and they'll be ready in about a year. R&D who's implementing the next version and fixing the bugs so they know like feature X has a lot of bugs, we really need to fix that. And then there's that general expertise about our own understanding of where the market was heading and what people needed. One of my passion projects was the CFD Vision 2030 study, from which I drew a lot of inspiration from. This is kind of where we need to get. Meshing needs to be invisible, right? That's really what that was all about. At the same time, we did have this Pointwise advisory team that was select customers, partners, and our distributors, where they could kind of help us prioritize. We'd have meetings, we do online meetings where they could help us kind of sort through that list. And I'll admit, it's not a perfect system. It was, like I said, it was a running joke that, we weren't doing a good job because, people would say, there's this wish that's in here. We will never work on this. And then there were big wishes, the requests that have been in our wish list for 10 years that were significant, like support polyhedra, that we finally got around to 10 years later. So that was an active discussion. So the question is, you do the best you can. And just based on everything you will never know everything, right? What's the Zen mantra? You spend months and months and months collecting all this data to quantify your decision. And then when it's time for the decision, you make a snap judgment based on what your gut says. So you collect enough data so that you feel good about making that intuitive guess about what's the right thing to do next. Like when there's nothing holy about any feature. You could say, or whatever your product is, there's nothing holy about any capability. You could say, we're 6 months in, this thing is horrible. It's not going to work out. I'm going to need 2 years. Let's pull it out. On the other hand, when we made that transition from GridGen to Pointwise, we got a year and a half in and people were like, hey, this is taking a long time. Maybe we should stop. And we're like, no, we're doing the right thing. Let's keep on moving. So again, you take all the data and then you use your expertise and gut to kind of move it forward. Were all those decisions correct? Number one, probably not. Number two, define what correct means in that context.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you, what metric do you, or metrics do you use? So, coming along with this, you you took time to, to spend on marketing, right? You were writing Another Fine Mesh for years. How many years was it that you wrote the blog Another Fine Mesh? 500 publications of it, right? Or over
I
500.
think I remember the 500th post, but that was close to the end. But I want to say it was 11 or 12 years. I don't remember
Okay.
exactly. But yeah, that was a lot of fun.
So that was very innovative for this space, right? This idea. It felt that way to me when I came across it, and you being the first one, or one of the first to do this inbound type content marketing for a company like that. Was that, where did you get the idea, and what kept you going on that? And yeah, just really curious on that.
Well, this is more personal than business strategy, but I was always an early adopter of social media. So I was like on all the platforms trying them out, see what you could do. And to supplement my reading of books, and I prefer paper books. I don't like to read on a Kindle or anything like that. But I also started reading a lot of blogs in the space, whether it was engineering or marketing or business or things like that. And I had an RSS feed that had like 300 different blogs or website that I was following, and I would read those on a kind of regular basis. And one of those was a fella named Dharmesh Shah, who's one of the founders of HubSpot. And
Hmm.
his blog was one of the first places I had heard the term inbound marketing used. And the more I started reading about it, I said, yes, this is, everyone wants to pigeonhole engineers like we're a bunch of dullards and we don't get online and like to read things and share information. And I was like, no, that's not true. I mean, there's people here who want to be informed, who are probably like me looking for information that can help them in their daily jobs. So as our marketing kind of made that turn, we started out like everybody else. We sent newsletters in the mail, right? Printed newsletters. We would send those out. And then we would do email newsletters, which we did keep doing. But then we were like, okay, let's try this social thing a bit. So we said, okay, let's make a blog. We can use the other channels to amplify that. What kind of content do you want to put on the blog? So, I was reading a lot of things about the frequency of blog posts, what to post about, how your post should be split in terms of, thought leadership, simply news and awareness, things like that. And we just kind of made the leap and said, okay, fine. One of the hats I wore at marketing, I tried to explain this to somebody the other day and they were completely incredulous. So on the Pointwise org chart, I actually reported into marketing as product manager. So I got to do a lot of marketing content creation, even though I also had, executive team functions, and I had responsibility for product development and business operations at the same time. But I was in marketing, so I, volunteered to do a lot of the writing because, as you can tell, I like to talk and I like to write. So it just kind of became a natural thing. And in the beginning, with the blog Another Fine Mesh, I learned immediately that writing is very hard, very difficult. Blank screen syndrome is real. When you need to write a post, there's nothing more imposing than just seeing that cursor blinking there on the white page waiting for you to type something. So at a certain point, I had always been collecting and sharing in the office what people used to call business intelligence. So and so just released a new version. This person is now working here. This conference is coming up. And I said, well, that's something that other people might be interested too, people outside the company. And that began This Week in CFD. And that helped me get over that blank page syndrome because I sharing the news that I came across that I was already reading with everyone else. And that's kind of how that got started.
Yeah. What were the benefits, or were there things that surprised you about the actual impact of the marketing on the business, right? I mean, this inbound marketing, the idea is that you're attracting people to you. Were there things that you thought, wow, this is really cool, the results that we're seeing?
Okay. There's a number of ways to answer that. Number one, brand recognition is important. Pointwise was pretty popular in the US, but we had, you know, much less participation from Europe and places like that. So a blog is a great way to get the name out there. Just have the blog attached to the Pointwise name, because if people come to read Another Fine Mesh and they subscribe, they will end up then getting the other posts, which is, oh, we're going to be exhibiting at such and such show, or we just released this capability, blah blah blah. So that was one thing. Uh, the other part goes back to one of Pointwise's core values, which was being collaborative. And collaboration doesn't end inside the office. It doesn't mean like play well with your coworkers. It means go out and write a paper with a customer about an application of CFD that uses the product. Get involved in committees at the professional societies that advance the overall state of the technology into which your product fits. Uh, Simple things like sponsoring conferences. Um, those are those are easy things to do, to collaborate with the broader industry. And the blog helped us let people know that we weren't just the typical greedy software vendor, that we actually wanted to work with you to help you solve your problems. And we were rewarded when some of our customers would retire and they would send us these great notes that said, you know, working with your people defines the word collaboration. It's more like a partnership than it is just a sales event or software. So that combining the reputation development and then the brand recognition together through the blog was extremely helpful. If you've read a lot of books, it sounds like you have. Have you read Simon Sinek's book? You know, people don't buy what you do; they buy why you do it. So we were able to kind of convey to people our enthusiasm for meshing, which most people hate. Uh, and I think they were, you know, it became one of those things where the blog got the name recognition so that when it came time for people to buy software, they would say it was just word of mouth. I heard about if you want a mesh generator, Pointwise is the one to get. So they just kind of get it that way. So that really helped. But then as a way to share what we're doing, it's better than running an ad in a magazine. I mean, that's, you know, dead tree advertising for CFD is should be dead. I can't see how it actually works, as opposed to something that's interactive. Because that's the other thing about social. It's not just the blog. You complement the blog by amplifying it on other channels like LinkedIn or Twitter, or we use Facebook, we use Instagram. Allows you to have a conversation with people. The blog does too, because people can write comments. But then that interaction further kind of cements the relationship and allows them to see you as a real kind of person, why you're doing this, and that you understand them and their problems. So I think all of those things taken together, it allows you to be found rather than that continuous old fashioned just push of information and, you know, hope something sticks.
Yeah. So along this, and it's kind of come out a little bit, and this is a little. So as you've advanced in your career and as you grew, it looks like there was less and less time to to be involved on maybe some really technical things, but at the same time, and this is just my observation, like how did you balance staying up to date on the amount of information you had to process as an executive, right? Like just you're in the weeds on specific decisions about product, but yet you're up in the air about industry trends and where things are headed and balancing all the other stuff. Were there things or practices that you implemented that helped you transition between each of those mindsets? Because it looks to me like they require different ways of thinking.
I'm smiling because one of my happiest days as a business owner, and this probably happened later than it should have. It was in probably the late 20 aughts. I was in a meeting. We're discussing a feature in the software, and I made a statement about, well, you could do it this way or you could do it that way. And the R&D manager, the product development manager, put up his hand and said, you don't need to be involved in that. And it was almost though he had given me permission not to have to care. If that's the wrong way to put it, not to be overly concerned, because, and that that kind of change in perspective really worked to our advantage over time, because we developed such a strong team of leaders. And I'm talking about me, John, and Rick, having developed the people who ran tech support, R&D, all of the teams within the company, that we didn't have to be involved in that level of detail. We didn't have to. There's a thing that I learned from Vistage from an author named Patrick Ungashik, who talks about the true value of a company. One of those value points is owner independence. That's what you strive for. Like if I got hit by a bus, Pointwise would have continued to run without a glitch. Or to be less dramatic about it, I could take a vacation for 2 weeks and no one would call me. I was confident that anything that came up, the team we had in place could handle, whether it's a customer complaint or some problem with the code or something weird with the health insurance or whatever. The team we had put into place had the skills, aptitude, initiative to solve it. So that helps with that wearing many hats things. Everyone in a small company, and Pointwise at its maximum was like 30 people, which many people are shocked because they would say, oh, God, I thought you were guys like 100. Is that everyone has to wear those hats. But, in the roles that I was in, as soon as I was able to say, oh, okay, you guys get it, we're all on the same page. And that's the other thing, too, that because we do sync on a regular basis, I know that the team is on the same page. There's that trust there that it just worked, and it lessened my particular burden. Now, I'm enough of a control freak where I still participated in feature reviews, which would be when a feature got done, I was one of the people who would go in and test it to make sure it met the functional requirements, that it didn't crash, and that it did what it was intended to do in the first place. And I was notorious at not really being able, I never was able to break the feature itself, what it was supposed to do, but I would break things on the fringes of it. I would type in weird things or do things in a weird sequence, and I would get things back like, that should never have happened, or that bug has been in there for 20 years, or things like that. That's a side story. So, but that freedom that the team, again, going back to what's most important is the team, that there's that trust, that there's that ability to take initiative, allows, me to do the other things I need to do. Because when it came to producing work, marketing was probably where I was the biggest producer, because I wasn't writing code. I wasn't writing functional requirements. I wasn't producing there. My work output, and this is another Lencioni book, is called Death by Meeting, where he says basically when you get to a certain point in your career, you realize that a meeting is your work product, which is why meetings have to have a certain structure, purpose, and all that kind of stuff. That I was able to just do the meetings and oversight to stay informed, not status meetings, but help make decisions about certain things, whether that was on the operations side or the technical side. So that kind of work to my advantage, while also allowing me to let the little control freak inside my head still have some kind of insight into what was going on in the different teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I think maybe it's just me in the phase I'm in right now, but I see. Yeah, that's really helpful. That's very helpful. Of owner independence is the theme there, right?
In the long term, yes,
Yeah.
but in those early days, no such thing, right?
Well, yeah, you said 12 to 16 hours a day for 7 days a week, and that's just how it was the first year. So
My wife will still tell
growing
you
with
the
the company.
story that my home office where Pointwise was started was in our bedroom. It was a little nook off the side of the bedroom, and she could tell stories about being woken up at like 2 a.m. with faxes coming in from somewhere in Asia. So it was not. You don't have time to worry about that in the early days, and that's okay, because you got to do what it takes to bring in revenue and satisfy a customer, right? You got to do that. It's when you get to about the awkward 20 to 25 employees, that's where things get awkward because you're big enough where you need structure, but small enough when you impose it, it feels awkward. But you
Mm,
need that structure to move to the next level to get to 30, 35, 40 employees. And that structure is things like simply a formal meeting rhythm, who meets, what do we do, process standardization and things like that. Because I'm a big believer in process, documented process and procedures, not because we're trying to impose this is how you do things at Pointwise. This is how you no, it's you tell us how you do your job. That if you get hit by a bus, someone could step into your role. And that's have you heard the term bus factor before?
I believe so.
Yeah, the bus factor is how many people have to get hit by a bus before you lose the capabilities to do a certain aspect of your
Yeah.
business, whether that's invoicing or the person who runs the build system for your software or something like that. That cross training is key. And again, the people I've worked with are probably laughing because I've got like a million little things like bus factor and turning buttons green on Tuesday that I repeat all the time because they mean something particular inside Pointwise to convey a point so that we don't have to have the same conversation over and over again.
Yeah. It's it's the title of an entire dissertation, right? Of context. Um I've even seen that though in my personal thing. One of the things I've been implementing from right, I'm a one man business right now, and even documenting something just to take the mental load off of remembering how to do it is beneficial for me as a one person business. And then the second thought there is just making me smile as I am in the corner of our bedroom with my business right now. So it's some parallels there. I'll be happy if I can make a fraction of the shadow of what you've done though.
Well,
So
let's not go there. But
with
sorry, let me interrupt real quick. What you just said
yeah.
echoes another book which I highly recommend to people about personal productivity. It's a book by David Allen called "Getting Things Done," and one
Getting
of
things
his
done.
concepts is getting everything out of your head and down into a trusted system, whether it's a little day planner or
Mhm.
something like that, or an online system. Get it out of your head and written down so you can refer to it later because so you're not stressing about it because the brain tends to like to go back to these things. If it's the
The
only
open
place
loop.
that's holding onto that data, he makes the very interesting observation that when you feel most calm at work, it's the day when you're about to leave for vacation. Because when you're leaving for vacation, you tell people, I'm going to be gone for a week. I'm passing this off to Jimmy. I'm passing this task off to Susie. I've told people I'll get back to you in a week, and that's all clear. So there's everything is taken care of, and you don't have to carry that information around, and that's where the trusted information system concept comes from. So I'm glad you're
Yeah.
a note taker and a procedure documenter.
I'm working on it. There's always room to improve. So, what is the scoop on gibberish?
I knew that was going to come up sooner or later. So after I retired, there's two ways to look at it. I refer to it as a vanity company because companies like when you've retired and you're at the end of your career, but you want to feel like you're still needed and maybe someone will want your advice. You want to have a company so you can do consulting, but mostly to satisfy your own vanity that you're still relevant and things like that. So I that's one way to look at it. The other thing is that I wanted to have a company that would support the other things that I do that, outside my personal life, which is I'm on the advisory board at my alma mater. I still go to AIAA conferences. I'm still a member of the CFD 2030 Vision Committee, so I like to go to their meetings. And I do have some experiences that might be relevant to people, about who are in the CFD world or looking for leadership advice or how to grow their career. That whole idea about mentoring, which has come back around in my career often enough. I've got some things I could pass on to people, and allows, it's a legal entity that allows that to kind of happen in an efficient way. So it's Gibberish Consulting is on the internet, and if anyone wants to talk, that's where you could find me. But it was just kind of a fun way to not take it too seriously because, like I said, I'm really enjoying being retired, but I do want to pass on anything that I have that might be of value to.
Yeah. Just two notes on that. I loved the way you described it on your page, that just the play on words, right? Gibberish, and isn't that what consultants do? But just your statement was something along the lines of you need someone to cut through the gibberish and be a clear voice, and that really resonated. That's personal experience. One of my first interactions, or the first interaction, was seeking your guidance on a decision that I was making, and it was really helpful for me. So I'm excited to see that. Be kind of closing up at this point. I have the link here, but I don't have the actual statement. But it was a article that you had come across, written in the future, a futuristic article, and it was something I think you'd written on the blog of, and I'm really going to botch it here, but the idea of we're going back to wind tunnels, and wind tunnels is the new thing. And can you just talk about, of course it was written in jest anyway, but just maybe some backstory on the paper or the article that was written.
This is something so the article I think is called "Will the Wind Tunnel Replace the Computer?" And it is written,
yes, thank you,
decades in the future. And I had originally come across it in the late 80s when I was working at General Dynamics, when things like this were passed around, photocopies of pieces of paper. And I just thought it was hilarious, and I kind of stuck it in a file, and I'd pull it out and read it. And then I lost my paper copy. And I thought, this article really needs to see the light of day again. I say again because probably the current generation of engineers hasn't seen it at all. So it's not again, it would be for the first time. So I went back to a friend of mine who's a font of knowledge and information at NASA. I said, do you have a copy of this? And he did. And he sent me the PDF, and I turned it into a blog post. But it's hilarious because it's, in the future, everything's done on the computer, but they're looking at ways to craft wind tunnel models out of stainless steel that model the faceting of the mesh on the model, so the results from the wind tunnel will match the simulation results. And I think they talk about the difficulties of doing inviscid flow in the wind tunnel to model inviscid flow in the solvers or something like that. It's just a funny backwards way of looking at things, like we had forgotten everything we once knew about testing and simulation, which is kind of funny because the fellow, a good friend of mine who is still the head of product development for the Pointwise product, started his career at General Dynamics, where I met him, in the model test group. So he was one of those people who designed and performed designed the stainless steel wind tunnel models, put them in the tunnel, blew air over them and things like that. And now he's doing CFD as a programmer. So it's interesting how these things come around.
Yeah, that's awesome. So in all seriousness though, what are the trends, right? You've had a whole career in a perspective that's very different from, I think, many people, in both to the organizations you've been involved with, the personal experience of developing code the first 10 years of your career, and seeing the evolutions of these things. But what are some of the trends that you're seeing? What are some of the headwinds and the tailwinds that we're seeing with compute and CFD, scientific simulation?
Well, I'm really optimistic or bullish, as Wall Street would say, about CFD. I think it's an onward and upward thing. I think you've got cross industry organizations like CFD 2030 trying to herd the cats, not by directing them, but kind of focusing the effort on the longer term goals, thinking about, Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. The end is what do we need to be doing in 2030, things like that. But also, if you look at the software that's available to us today to do CFD, it's absolutely fantastic in terms of the capabilities it has, the types of flows we can simulate. I mean, my first CFD job was a 2D simulation that took a year, and the results weren't worth the computer budget I had spent on it. Now it's not even a homework problem for an undergrad, things like that. The advancement, and when people complain about CFD, what it can and can't do, the challenge is the problem size has continued to evolve over the years. So while the complaints remain the same, they're accurate. The answers aren't accurate enough. It takes too long to compute. Takes too long to make the mesh. It's like, well, yeah, but 10 years ago we were doing 100,000 cell problems, and now we're doing 500 million cell problems, and we're doing real gas effects with Flutter. So the problem size continues to expand. The complaints remain the same. So those are kind of a smokescreen. And I think going back to Tony Jameson's comment that CFD solver technology has plateaued, which he said maybe 15 years ago now, there's been such a resurgence in everything in CFD, algorithm development, how we look at results, the rise of GPU computing, cloud access, and so many people doing so many good things are working on CFD now that I can't help but be optimistic. A friend of mine who works for the DoD, and I was in a discussion with somebody about this on LinkedIn the other day. He said, no one in industry is doing CFD these days to look at the flow field. They're doing it to get results that will support an aircraft development program or something like that, to get real engineering answers. That's what it's all about. That's where that focus is now. The CFD has turned into that type of tool. It's just a tool. And making it just a tool is a great advancement because it's just another toolkit that an engineer can use to solve whatever the engineering challenge is. So all of these things come together. I mean, I'll do a little advertising. The team that I retired from at Cadence, the NUMECA team with their marine capabilities, turbomachinery capabilities, their Hexpress mesher combined with Pointwise's meshing capabilities, and now ANSA has come on board from the Beta CAE acquisition. That's another CFD preprocessor, but also the solid mechanics capabilities, the people on those teams, and then you've got the acquisition of the Charles solver from Cascade and LES and all that, advancing that knowledge base. Fantastic. And that's just a microcosm. That's one company that has assembled all of this talent. And you've got teams like that all over at different places. The open source world, the proprietary world, the work that being done in government codes, it's all very forward-looking and effective. And where we'll be by 2030 is really exciting now because we have opportunities to solve a lot of those problems. And like I tell people, 2030 has almost turned into a brand instead of a date at this point because the challenges are going to extend to 2040 and beyond, but the progress is really incredible.
Yeah. One question I have, and I see this debate, and I think I oscillate between sides, but maybe paraphrasing T.S. Eliot's words, where is the insight we have lost in iterations? Do you feel like there's some of that for a newcomer to the field, because the tools are so easy, and right, you give the example, you spent a year on a simulation, and now that's not even a homework problem, but maybe some students are missing out on, myself included, right? My generation is missing out on some of the hard-learned lessons that you didn't forget because it wasn't so easy to get into it and to start producing stuff. And I'm not trying to ask for a right or wrong, but just maybe some insight you have on that regard of a newcomer to the field. And
The fact that early career CFD people now do not have to suffer the problems we did back in the 80s and early 90s is a good thing. Because again, with CFD being just a tool, they could go ahead to apply the tool to problems of interest, the real problems that companies are trying to solve to make better products, and you can define better however you want to define it. So I don't wish, there's no glory in having to suffer that pain. Now, at the same time, anyone who's using those tools has a responsibility. Current users have a responsibility to understand the fluid dynamics, understand the thermodynamic from a strictly fluids and thermal standpoint, to be able to judge whether the results they're getting are even valid or not. And hopefully they've done effective verification and validation of their tool set in their organization before they start using it. And if you're not doing V&V and you're an applied CFD user, you're doing it wrong. But the maturity of the tools allows that to be done. I mean, these are known. It's a solvable problem because we know how to actually do those implementations. That's the key, especially for undergraduate educations. I mentioned that I'm on the advisory board for my alma mater, and I keep telling people on a repeated basis, an undergraduate engineering degree is not a trade school. You are not there to learn how to push the buttons for any particular piece of software. What you're there to learn is to develop the aptitude to understand fluids and thermal and structures and whatever, so that when you can learn the tool, that's a skill. That's an employer's responsibility to teach you the skill to use the tool. You have to have the understanding, and your organization has to provide the frameworks so the tool is used responsibly in a way. And one of your favorite words, I think, is suitability, so that you can get suitable results at the end that support an engineering decision. So the fact that current engineers don't have to struggle the way we did, I think that's a great thing. They struggle in different ways, because remember what I said about problem size expanding. They'll struggle when they do fluid structure interaction, or they have weird reacting flows or hypersonic flows where it's very difficult to get experimental data. They suffer in different ways. But I think the maturation of the technology, that change is a constant. And what underlies that is people who understand what's being simulated, fluids, thermal, solid mechanics thing.
That was a beautiful articulation of something I had lumped together but needed to be separated. Two issues. I'm working on it in my book and addressing it right now, and that I'm going to quote liberally from this. So thank you.
I have to.
Thank
now
you
I'm going to
very
have to
much.
listen to the recording to see what I actually said.
Well, no, I think it's really, I have lumped that in my mind unconsciously, that suffering through a lesson, right? Because I maybe made a foolish mistake or did something or didn't have an adequate tool, or not even an adequate tool, it was still adequate first time, but didn't have a tool that's available now, puts a premium on the knowledge when the knowledge could be obtained more efficiently. The goal is the understanding, not the process used to get the understanding. If we have a better process now to convey the same amount of understanding and deliver results, then let's do it. Like, for example, I have had this on one of my laundry list items to go back through the fluid mechanics videos done in the 60s and to do some of those canonical flows in CFD so you can get better visualization, right? They're black and white videos. But I think the amount of teaching that you could do using those videos, and I had professors that used those videos and they were great, but imagine the upgrade that could be done with some DNS on some simple flows and teaching some of those concepts. So just that as an idea of an example.
You're familiar with the album of Fluid Motion by Van Dyke, which is a
Yes,
classic book
yeah.
full of black and white photographs. Recently, I saw someone started an album of computational flows. They were doing similar things, but doing it in computational techniques that illustrate the same effects. So that sounds very similar to, kind of your vision about where things should be going.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's just like you said, we don't want to regress. And Yeah, every major advancement of civilization has come because we outsourced a lower level, not lower level in the like lower level, but because now our minds are freed up to tackle something else, right? And we don't need to spend as much time and effort or resources on a problem. We can use dedicate those resources elsewhere. So
And someone once said, giving CFD tools to undergraduates or new engineers who don't have a PhD is like giving children a gun to play with. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because how miserly would we have to be to want the current generation of engineers to suffer like we did? I mean, that seems horrible. And the key is the analogy I've used before over and over again is, I don't need to know how my internal combustion engine in my car works to drive it. I want to get in the car, go where I need to go, and be done with it. And I'm willing to, remain ignorant of those things. However, I still got to know where I'm going, when to change the oil, when it's out of fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of a balance there, that CFD priesthood that many people preach to. And we need people who have that level of expertise, but not when you're making a car or an airplane or a heart valve or a turbo machine or a UAV. Those are different things.
yeah. Well, great discussion. And thank you so much for joining and sharing your wisdom, and really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing more, and maybe there'll be a round 2 in the future. So
Great.
Anyway, thank you,
Thanks
John.
for the opportunity. I'm glad we had a chance to, after exchanging all that information via Twitter and LinkedIn and emails, that we finally got to have an extended face-to-face conversation, as it were.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening. Really, thank you. Did something about this episode stand out to you? If so, please go ahead and share it with others on LinkedIn or other social media so they can find this as well. See you next time.